I purchased this at the Totally Farms Holiday Fair.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
And welcome to all gathered here and to those in Chicago Heights, Columbia, and Jackson. Happy 2020. I hope that your celebration of the Feast of Christmas continues to hold many Christmas moments that will carry you through this new year. Thank you all for the many wonderful ways that you provided Christmas moments for us through your cards and your smiles and your gatherings and your prayers, and most especially your presence in our life. You make a difference, a tremendous difference for our Dominican community. I was struck this morning at Mass by the words from the first reading from Isaiah. Rise up in splendor, your light has come, the glory of the Lord shines upon you. That's certainly a message of hope for us as we begin this new year. So Happy New Year to you and all of your families. Our speaker today is Sister Marceline Koch, who will be speaking on Catholic social teachings. Sister Marceline is one of our Dominican sisters and the director of the Office for Peace and Justice for our Dominican Sisters of Springfield. In this capacity, she serves as the justice promoter, the co-coordinator of the Springfield Dominican Anti-Racism Team, and liaison for the congregation's socially responsible investing effort. Sister is just finishing her 6-year term as the North American co-promoter for justice for the Dominican family in North America. And it was in this capacity that she was able to be part of a delegation to Iraq in January of 2015. Previous to this ministry, Sister Marceline was on our congregation's leadership team for 8 years. She also directed Project Irene, which is an education and advocacy initiative focused on women and children. Marceline was an elementary school educator and administrator for over 30 years, serving both in urban and rural areas. And she currently volunteers on the leadership committee for the Springfield Coalition on Dismantling Racism. So we are very happy today to welcome Sister Marceline.
Thanks, Sister Joan, and it's really good to be with all of you and to share about something that I do have passion about, and I know that many of you do too. We'll start our time together with the prayer. I think you have a copy of it there. And when it comes time to the song, I'm just going to sing it through once. I also gave Sister Joan a copy to help out. I'm not a solo singer. But it's just a mantra that repeats itself. You'll very quickly pick it up, and we'll sing it a couple of times. I'll do the opening part, to which you respond. We have a reader that will share with us from Isaiah, and then all together we will, do the closing piece. That little piece at the top talks about how all the prayer of our life is in keeping with the theme of justice and peace. The liturgy of the church is that as well. And I'll let you take that and reflect on that on your own time to think about how justice and peace is intimately connected with who we are as church. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Join me. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Again. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. We sing of peace with the words of English and Hebrew and Arabic. And we pray, grant us, God, a vision of your world as your love would have it. A world where the weak are protected and none go hungry or poor. A world where the riches of creation are shared and everyone can enjoy them. A world where different races and cultures live in harmony and mutual respect. A world where peace is built with justice and justice is guided by love. Give us the inspiration and courage to build it through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Amen.
And now we'll listen to a meditation on violence and prayer based on Isaiah.
This is the fast that pleases me, to break unjust fetters, to let the oppressed go free, to share your bread with the hungry, and shelter the homeless poor. If you do away with the yoke, the clenched fist, the wicked word, if you give your bread to the hungry and relief to the oppressed, your light will rise in the darkness.
And together we respond. Give us, O God, this vision, which can see your love in the world, in spite of human failure. Give us the faith to trust your goodness, in spite of our ignorance and weakness. Give us the knowledge that we may continue to pray with understanding hearts, and show us what each one of us can do to set forward the coming of the day of universal peace. Amen. Catholic social teaching, which is the title of our time together, is about promoting justice and peace. And the call to do justice and peace is nothing less than the call to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to evangelize the world. The promotion of justice and peace it fits what Jesus came to do. You recognize this when he went to the temple. It's in Luke 4, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." And then he gives a description of his mission in the world. His mission, to bring the good news, to proclaim release, to recovery of sight, and to set free, to liberate others. This is what Jesus incarnated in his ministry, and he commissioned us to replicate all of this in our hearts, in our communities, our society, and our world. You know, the richness of all of this that you're going to hear about is more than a list of principles to be recited. It's really a living and breathing tradition, so that we can orient ourselves to being in right relationship. We orient our lives and our communities toward this right relationship with God, with ourselves too, others, and also with all of creation, including the non-human parts of creation. Vatican II focused on this understanding of Jesus. And so soon afterward, Pope Paul VI established a commission, a pontifical commission for justice and peace. And it was to keep reminding the church about what is central to the church's mission. And Pope Francis has taken that a step further. He has put together, he took 4 of them, and put together what he's calling the integral, promoting integral human development. And the Pontifical Justice and Peace Commission is under that. You see the word dicastery, which is just another Vatican word for department. Think of it that way. But you see on the bottom the kinds of things that dicastery focuses on. It focuses on folks and situations that are marginalized and excluded. You have migrants, sick, imprisoned, unemployed, victims of armed conflict, disasters, and forms of slavery and torture, the kinds of things they list for that. It was in 1971, I think it was, that the Synod of Bishops even made this statement, that justice is constitutive to the gospel. Someone said to me just now about doing this, and she said, well, you've been doing this a long time, and yes, I have. But you know, when I first started it, it was kind of like I taught school, or I was a principal, and then justice was something you did on the side. And we've come as a church to know that it isn't just a side issue. It is something that is integral and constitutive to our preaching the gospel, which means it's intrinsic to our baptismal call. It's intrinsic to our Dominican call. And it doesn't mean that, okay, I have to stop what I'm doing and take up this other project. No, that isn't what it means. What it means is that I use the lens of justice and peace for whatever I do. It's the perspective that helps to shape how I see life and what's going on. And so I want today to help you have the lens of justice and peace. And since the time of Jesus, when he made his mission statement, the church has struggled to do this. We've struggled to be faithful. In the early church, and especially as the church was spreading to the Greco-Roman world, they struggled with the issues, the very same issues that we struggle with today. They struggled with wealth, they struggled with war, and they struggled with the use and abuse of power. Many of the same things that we are struggling with now. And actually that continued down through the periods. If you go through the history from the time of the early church, the medieval periods, you had the time of exploration and colonization, you went to the Reformation, the Enlightenment. All of those periods had their very same struggles with these three issues. But they also had periods of wonderful times when people were faithful to that liberating message of Jesus. But it's the struggles that we always are trying to have to look at to see where we need to go. Over time, there came to be a body of teachings that the church developed on matters of social justice, and involving all of these issues and even more. And these teachings came to be known as Catholic social teaching. It's like this rich treasure of how to build holy lives and how to live holy lives in the midst of all the challenges that all of us face. And that brings us, as we look at that, to 1893, when Pope Leo XIII did an encyclical, or it's 1891, pardon me, did an encyclical called Rerum Novarum. It was about the plight of workers and industrial capitalism at the time. And since the time of Leo XIII, there have been lots of encyclicals, other writings, and when you came in, you had a handout. What I have given you here is just, it says major Vatican documents. Didn't give you all of them, and tried to give you just a very brief synopsis. But when you take this and look at it, you get a sense of the kinds of writings that our church has done. On the other side are some of the U.S. bishops' major statements. Because these documents helped us to know how to be in the world. And then from all of these documents, there were bishops and also Catholic social teaching scholars, you might say, or even activists, that as they read them, there were things that kept getting repeated. There were themes throughout them. And these themes you have on your other sheet. And they're what we call the key principles of Catholic social teaching. or key themes. These are the ideas that undergird what the church says about Catholic social teaching. And it's always important to remember that as these themes are developed, the teaching itself is not set in stone because our circumstances change. So we have to continually look at what is this saying and what's happening in our world today. It's developing. And now before we go into these themes, I want to draw attention to this understanding. We often talk about when you do the work of justice, you do it with 2 feet. It doesn't always work if you're able-bodied that you can walk on just 1 foot. So there's the first foot is that of direct service. When there's a crisis, people pitch in and help out. But the other foot, the harder one to use, is the foot of social change. If people are so poor, then why are they poor? What's happening? How do we have things set up that people have to be in such crisis? I always remember the saying of Dom Helder Câmara. He was a bishop from Brazil. He's now deceased, but he worked in justice areas. And he said at one time, he said, if I feed people, I am praised. If I ask why they're hungry, I'm called a communist. And that was the time, a period of history when that was the thing to do. There's also an adage that a lot of people say, give a starving person a fish and they eat for a day. But if you teach them to fish, they eat for a lifetime. However, that's no longer actually true. We have to add to that quote, and this is the part of social change. That, teaching them to fish so they can eat a lifetime is great and all, but here are some questions. Who owns the lake? Why do only certain people get the opportunity to fish in it? How did the lake end up so polluted? Or why doesn't the sea have fish anymore? Or why has the lake dried up? So there's questions beyond just helping someone in a crisis. Now, as we look at these themes, I'm going to share facts and add things to flesh out the context and the context of our day. And because that's what we're supposed to do, we're supposed to make those connections. And as I lift up issues under each of the themes, you can say, well, also that fits the theme of, maybe there's another principle that you want to include. And I also want to say that as I talk about things, and if there's something you are particularly interested in, if you make a note of that and give it to me afterwards, I can try to provide you with resources about it, if there's something that you want to know more about, if that would be helpful. So before we start looking at our themes, I always want to check. What I like to do is have somebody in the room read the theme that's on the paper. I know everybody can read, but it makes a difference to have something stated brought into the room. So I'll need 7 volunteers. If it could be associates or associate candidates, let's try to do it that way first. So who would do the dignity of the human person? And your name? Jim? Okay, Jim's got that one. All right, and the rights and responsibilities. Other volunteers? And your name?
Jan.
Jan, okay. We're going on the J's here. And the community and the common good. Jeffrey, okay. And option for the poor. Linda, I do know you. And then dignity of work, economic justice. Dave? And did I see another hand back there? Okay, I'll give you number 6. You are?
Betsy.
Betsy? And 7. Stephanie, okay. Good, then we're ready to go to move through this. So we'll start with our first one, and that would be Jim. And Jeffrey has the, would you just pass on the mic then to the next person when they are ready to read?
As children of God, created in God's image, human persons have a preeminent place in creation. There is a unique and sacred worth that is present in each person simply because she or he exists. Human dignity is not earned by achievements nor bestowed by any authorities other than God. It is not dependent on race, creed, color, economic class, political power, social justice, culture, personal abilities, gender, sexual orientation, or any other dimension by which people discriminate social groupings.
In one sense, this is like a no-brainer. It should be that we respect the dignity of all. But I think you can probably cite quite a few instances that it's a common response in our world that some people count more than others. And we have to really resist buying into that. Our community has corporate stances, which I'll talk about a little bit later. One of them is on the consistent ethic of life. And it speaks to this in our commitment to the whole of Earth. It includes those in the womb, the newborn, the children growing up, the disabled, the well-abled, the sick, the dying. All have dignity. Pope Francis says that peace is threatened by every denial of human dignity. I want to share with you a story from our Dominican history that speaks to this dignity of persons. And it concerns, oops, I forgot to move consistent ethic of life here. Someone named Las Casas, Bartolome de Las Casas. Las Casas lived in the 15th and 16th century. He was a priest and he traveled to the New World, to Hispaniola with the explorers, and that often happened in the time of exploration. And what happened with the clergy, they often did things that the explorers did. So like the explorers, he owned slaves at one time. And then he heard a sermon, and he began to see things differently, and he gave his slaves freedom. He eventually joined the Dominican order and argued for the humanity of the Indians on the island of Hispaniola. And whom did he hear in that sermon? He heard a Dominican named Antonio Montesinos. And the only reason we know about this in our day is because Las Casas wrote about it. It was an Advent Sunday in 1510, and there were Dominicans on Hispaniola. They'd been there for about a year. And they talked as a community and said, you know, we've got to say something about this. And so they talked together, and they chose their best preacher, who was Antonio Montesinos. And this is what he said in his preaching. By what right or justice do you keep the Indians in such horrible servitude? Are they not human? Have they not rational souls? Are you not bound to love them as you love yourselves? Dignity of persons. One of our efforts in respecting the dignity of others is our anti-racism work. We have a commitment to be on the path to becoming an anti-racist congregation. And to move this effort forward, we established a team in 2004. And we currently have 45 members. About half are our sisters, and the others are partners, mostly persons of color, and we have associates on that team as well. And I know that in another session, you'll hear more about our anti-racism work. So I'll move on to some other things today. And we'll go to the second one, which is Jan.
Rights and responsibilities. Human dignity can be protected, and a healthy community can be achieved only if basic human rights are protected and responsibilities are met. Therefore, every person has a fundamental right to life and a right to those things required for human decency. They include civil, political, and socioeconomic rights. They are to be recognized by communities and governments. They do not derive from the dictates of governments. Nor are they earned or won by successful competition in the marketplace. It is the responsibility of each to respect and protect the human rights of all. Corresponding to these rights are duties and responsibilities to respect the rights of others and to work for the common good.
Last month, December 10th, we celebrated the 71st anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. It encompasses the rights that Jan talked about: political, legal, social, cultural, and economic. This was adopted in 1948, so it grew out of what happened in the Second World War because of Nazism and fascism. Before that time, leaders wouldn't have been able to have the kind of discussion they had, but they were able to because of what had happened. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chairperson for this group, and she worked with representatives from countries around the world to define the most essential universal rights and establish them in an official document. It was proclaimed by the UN General Assembly, and it has been translated into about 500 languages. Now, this is not legally binding, but it is a living document that is used by groups around the world. We may say, well, we don't need that here. Well, sometimes I think we do. But there are other places in the world where I know of women who hold this up as trying to get their rights for what is happening in their country. So it is a contract between the government and its people, and it's a very important piece of this. As a part of our celebration, the Dominicans, in our 800-year celebration of Dominican order, it ended in 2016. We Dominicans held a Congress on the promotion and defense of human rights. It was in Salamanca, Spain. Salamanca was chosen because it's the home of the centuries-old university and the Dominican presence there since the 1500s. So there were over 200 Dominican friars, sisters, laity, and colleagues that gathered. What you see behind is not the university, but it is the front of the church connected to the Dominican Friars Convent there. And earlier I told you, about Las Casas and the friars in Hispaniola. And what those friars did, and Las Casas was a part of this, they would write back to the friars at Salamanca and say, this is what's happening where we are, and it's not right, and they shared the experiences. Those who were studying, the friars at the university that were studying and doing writing, began to write about that. And one of those Dominicans at Salamanca, Francisco Vitoria, is noted as being the father of international human rights because their writings eventually became the foundation for what countries began to do when they talked about human rights. Now, along with rights and rights come responsibilities, of course. I think there's a drive in all of us that we want to be involved in decisions and activities that affect us. I think we want to say in things, and that's part of our responsibility So we share that, whether it's in our neighborhood, our city, whatever we are about. And we have a responsibility for doing something. We also have a right and a responsibility to participate in political institutions. And our church has been very strong about saying that it is our duty to do this. Every election year, they publish Faithful Citizenship, calling us to this. Now, I'm very aware that being involved politically is an uphill struggle. I meet a lot of cynicism in people. I meet people who say, oh, I don't vote, doesn't do any good. And I understand that. And yet, if we are not involved, if we don't take our responsibility for that, we contribute to the continued downfall. We have to be in it somewhere. And it's really hard with the extreme polarization these days. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to talk to others that don't think like you do. And yet, if we, on this level, can't talk to each other, how can we expect nations to talk to one another? So we do have to start, and we do have to keep trying at that. And then a broader participation is a nation's participation in the United Nations. This is one of my favorite pictures. I took it when I was a volunteer at the UN 10 years ago, and that's why it's on a slant, because you had to take it that way. But Dag Hammarskjöld, he said it wasn't created to take humanity to heaven, but it surely was trying to help them keep out of hell. And that's the idea of the UN. It's a place to talk, to negotiate, to plan. It's also a place where every country has one voice and one vote. If you go into the International Monetary Fund or World Bank, your vote depends on how much money you put into it. But the UN is a place of hope, of some equality in that. I also think, I hear from people, well, you know, it's a bureaucracy. And granted it is. It's a bureaucracy in a sense. But it's always amazing to me. Later on, I will talk about world expenditures on military. But the UN budget is less than 2% than what the whole world spends on military. So 2% is a small price to pay for a place to talk and to be able to try to create some ways for peace. Okay, and we'll move on to our community.
Community and the common good. The human person is both sacred and social. Human dignity can be recognized, developed, and protected only in community with others. Each person is brother or sister to every other and can develop as a healthy human person only in a community of relationships rooted in love and justice. The foundational community for each person is his or her immediate family. The full community of each is the extended family of the whole human race through history within the larger community of created being. Each person benefits from the efforts of earlier generations and of their contemporaries and are therefore under obligation to them as well.
It's really something. We don't live our faith totally alone. We live our faith in community. Someone said to me recently, we don't go to God by ourselves. We come in with everyone else. So community is very important for us. In proclaiming the reign of God, Jesus, I think, envisioned a new way of being together. And he saw the community not characterized by exclusion, privilege, or discrimination. That wasn't his way. The community that Jesus envisioned and that he tried to live was one of equality, inclusion, and embrace. This was a radical idea in Jesus' time, and I think it's still a radical idea. Also, when I look at community, I think it forms the basis and the reason for doing what a lot of the other principles call for. And you know, I haven't heard it much recently, but you've had this myth of the self-made person or the self-made company, you know, they did it all by themselves. Now, granted, it does take individual effort, but there is no such thing as a self-made person or a self-made company. We do all of that. We only flourish in the context of community. Even companies that do great things, they build on what has come before, and that's part of community. Another word with this one is the common good. And they're very connected, and I've heard the common good spoken about more in public discourse in the last few years. But the common good says that my good, what happens to me, is connected to yours. So if I want good for myself, I need to be thinking about the good for you as well. And I think of that both in terms of, that's all creation, you know, both human and the non-human creation. I was thinking it should matter to us that refugees and migrants are desperate to find a safe place to live. We're not migrants and refugees, but it should matter to us about others. It should matter that small island nations are looking for a place to relocate their citizens. I just read about in the Trib last week, New Jersey is starting to buy out homes that they know in 10 or 15 or 20 years are going to be underwater because of rising sea levels. It should matter to us that Iraqis continue to struggle in having a free Iraq. It should matter to us that colonies of bees have been dying out and how that affects all the plants that we depend on. It should matter to us that asylum seekers are returned to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador to face the violence that they fled in the first place. All of these things, and there are so many more, but all of these things can need to be looked at in terms of what is the common good. And now we'll move on to the option for the poor, number 4.
Option for the poor. Scripture teaches us that God has a special concern for the poor and vulnerable. The church calls on all of us to put the needs of the poor and the vulnerable first. This preferential option for the poor and vulnerable should be reflected in both our daily lives and public policies. A fundamental measure of our society is how we care for and stand with the poor and vulnerable brothers and sisters.
Now, we just talked about the common good, and we are to seek the common good. But our tradition and scriptures, too, also call us to this priority concern for the poor and the vulnerable persons. And, you know, we hear this very strongly from Pope Francis. And when he early on said he wanted a church, he challenged us, actually, to be for the poor. He said to be a church of the poor, for the poor. So that is a real challenge. He goes on to say, on the global level, you know, we see this scandalous gap between the opulence of the wealthy and the utter destitution of the poor. Often you only need to walk on the streets of a city to see the contrast between the people living in the street and then the brilliant lights of store windows. And we become so accustomed to these that they no longer unsettle us. Those were his words to us. Greg Boyle is a Jesuit in Los Angeles in one of the hoods. If you've ever listened to him or read his books, he's quite interesting in his storytelling. He runs what's called Homeboy Industries, and it's to employ young people from the hood that want to get out of the gangs. But he uses this line always. He said, We need to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry and not in judgment on how they carry it. And you can think of that in a lot of other situations as well. Ron Rolheiser is an oblate priest and a spiritual writer, and he notes that 1 out of 10 sentences in the New Testament is a direct challenge to do something for the poor. So we have strong messages about this in our tradition. And as we talk about this, what often happens, somebody will, I just remember I did a presentation in a high school, and this kid came up to me afterwards and he said, "Sister, how much money can I make and it's still okay with God?" What I really want to say is, wealth of itself is not an evil. It's wealth alongside poverty that is abhorrent to our God. You know the story in the New Testament, there's a scripture reading about the rich man and Lazarus. And the rich man was in hell, not because he was rich. He was in hell because his riches kept him from seeing Lazarus in need. That was his fault at that part. So now I want to just do some talking a little bit about just poverty in our world and use something that's called the champagne glass distribution of income. Now this is world income. This is not a new thing, and yet every time I check it, it pretty much remains the same or maybe gets a little worse. What it shows, for all the income in the world, almost 83% of it goes to the richest 20%. And when we're talking world population, you and I are in that 20%. And you can see how it goes down. So the poorest 20% of the world have only 1.4% of the income. And then it stacks up with the others. So when we talk about an option for the poor, then this can help us to visualize what the world looks like in terms of wealth and income. Poverty has decreased in our world, that is true. Global poverty has fallen, but even so, 71% of the world's population remain low income or considered poor. Right now, the poverty rate has dropped everywhere but the Middle East and North Africa, and because of Syria and Yemen, because of what's happening there. When you have conflict, you destitute people. And also sub-Saharan Africa has pretty extreme poverty there. So it's still something that we have to be concerned about. There's a group called Oxfam. I don't know if you know them, but they're a global organization working on ending the injustice of poverty. Every January, they publish a gap report about wealth. And they do this, it'll come out toward the end of January, so you can watch for it. Because at that same time, the World Economic Forum is meeting in Davos, Switzerland. And that's the meeting it's an annual meeting of very elite political and business leaders. So Oxfam publishes a report to say, here's what the world looks like. And all you wealthy people and political people are going to go over here and talk about it. Davos, this was just some tidbit information as I was going over this and preparing it again. First of all, it's an invite-only group. And to belong, you pay either from $60,000 to $600,000 for your membership. And then for every person that you send, it costs you $27,000 just to send a person to Davos, to this forum. I just think that's interesting in the light of looking at something like this. So you've got wealthy people that can afford to pay that are going to do the World Economic Forum. Last year in the Oxfam report, they said that first of all, billionaires are increasing. Now that's partly because of inflation and of how that works. But they increased. This was 2019. Their report. They said a billionaire fortunes increased. The whole fortune increased by 12%, and while the poorest half of humanity saw their wealth decline by 11%. So there's an increase at the top and a decrease at the bottom. That's what's happening. They also said in 2017 and 2018, there was a new billionaire created every 2 days. So that's part of that wealth and income going up here, and yet they're paying lower tax rates. So this is just a picture of what's happening in our world and how that makes a difference. So this was talking about world. I want to talk about the U.S. for a minute. And to talk about the U.S., I need 10 volunteers. Sister Michaela, I'm going to have to ask you to move back there. Can you just move to one side? And my 10 volunteers, all you need to do is to go sit on a chair. You don't have to say anything. And you don't get embarrassed at this either. And then you might have to move from your chair. Okay? So, 10 volunteers. Come on, just go back and grab a chair. A number of people have seen this, but even if you've seen it before, it's sobering every time. Okay, that would be great.
I know what to do. It'll be okay.
Okay, you need one more. Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to ask you, what is your name here on the end?
Jennifer?
Jennifer, okay. Jennifer, today is your lucky day. Jennifer's going to be one of the wealthiest people in our world. Okay, so you get to stay there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Now we have 10 chairs. So think of each chair as being 10% of the wealth, not the income, the wealth in the United States. And we have 10 people, so each person represents 10% of the population. So we have each person, 10% of the population has 10% of the wealth. But we know that's not the way it is. You could have guessed that before. So we're going to get some perspective on this. We're going to go back to the year 1976. And in 1976, that 10%, wave your hand, Jennifer. She's 10%. In 1976, Jennifer owned 50% of the wealth. So that means the next 4 people, you're going to have to go over and share the chairs. You can stand behind them, but you're going to have to go over and share what these last 5 have. So the next 4 people get up and go over. I won't make you sit on their lap, but you can go behind. Okay, so now we have 10% of the people in 1976 had 50% of the wealth. You 90%, you shared the other half, okay? Now, you remember a few years ago with the Occupy movement, and they talked a lot about the 1%? Remember that? So, Jennifer, we're going to just say that, just think of her head as being 1%. And in 1976, that 1% owned 20%. So would you just sit in the second chair to kind of give us a visual for that? Even though her whole body has all 5 chairs, her head is 1%. She had 2 chairs. That's quite a bit. Now, let's fast forward. This was 2004, but it can be 2014, 2019, 2020. And you can guess what's going to happen, can't you? I know their names. Rosie and Diane are going to lose their chairs. So you're all going to have to squeeze in around the last 3. Come on, squeeze in together. Okay, now we have in our distribution of wealth, Jennifer, as 10% of the population, has 70% of our wealth. And her head, that little 1%, you move over to the fourth chair. So the 1% has 4 chairs, and the 90% has how many chairs? 3. So this, you can say, well, it's not exactly like that. It may not be exactly like that, but that is the trend. And that is what we need to know and be aware of. Okay? You can go back to your places. Thank you very much. Yes, they deserve a clap there. I remember on our Justice Committee back in the 90s when I wanted our committee to study economics, and it was almost had an uproar, a revolt on the committee. People don't usually like that, but I just think it's important for us to have some sense of this. I think economics is where everything is at. I mean, I believe in the spiritual piece of that. I'm not saying that. But if you're really understanding issues, you have to understand economics. The line, follow the money, it's not a stupid line. It's a very important line. So let's just think about, sometimes it's hard to grasp all of this. Let's think of the 3 richest people in the United States. It's Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett. And I'm not putting any one of them down. I'm stating a fact. Together, they have more wealth than the entire bottom half of the country combined. So that's pretty significant. And then, as you look at families, because then families become dynasties in all of this. So we have the 3 wealthiest families in the U.S. are the Waltons, Walmart, the Mars Candy family, and the Koch brothers. They spell it K-O-C-H, and we're no relation. Now, these are all enterprises built by grandparents and parents of those members of today's family. And so these 3 families own a combined fortune of over $300 billion. Of course, Jeff Bezos, I forget how many billion he has with Amazon. So it just gives you some sense of the picture out there. And then when someone, is struggling and they get judged for not using their money correctly or something like that. And then we have Pope Francis. If you looked at his Joy of the Gospel, his encyclical, this is what he says in it. He says, no to an economy of exclusion when people are left out. No to the idolatry of money. No to a financial system which rules rather than serves. And no to the inequality which spawns violence. And inequality does spawn violence. Yes, it does. The dignity of work, so I'll let you go ahead.
Dignity of work, economic justice. The economy must serve people, not the other way around. Work is more than a way to make a living. It is a form of continuing participation in God's creation. Work must be organized to serve the workers' humanity, support their family life, and increase the common good. If the dignity of work is to be protected, then the basic rights of workers must be respected. The right to productive work, to decent and fair wages, to the organization and joining of unions, to private property, and to economic initiative.
The paper says the dignity of work, but Pope Francis talks about work giving dignity to the person as well. And I've seen that for people who talk about losing a job and what it does to them. It really they really lose some of their own feelings even of self-worth if they don't have that. Just want to do some things focusing on, let's see, yes. So we talk about wages. I mentioned that as far as wages, there is some increase in the minimum wage, and there's always talk of living wages. But for the most part, in our country, the CEO pay has expanded greatly, and worker wages, in many cases, are very stagnant. So we have all this increased production, and the workers are not benefiting from the increase in production that's happened. If you use the minimum wage and go to a 40-hour week, it's approximately $19,240 a year. If you're trying to raise a family of 4, a poverty level for a family of 4 is considered the $25,750. So you see the minimum wage doesn't provide for that. There was a kind of a joke one time when they gave the number of jobs that had increased over a period of time, and one woman says, yeah, she says, I have 3 of those of the increase. And that's how some people feel sometimes, I know. As we look at unemployment, which right now the unemployment rate is very low, my understanding of our economic system and economic theory is that we need unemployment to make our system work. I do know that when unemployment is low, workers can be choosier about jobs, and sometimes they have more say about wages. If unemployment is very high, it means there's a surplus of workers, so people are willing to take whatever they can get. So I don't know enough. I haven't studied economics, but I do know that there is a relationship there. And even as we look at these lower numbers, it still obscures the experiences of many who are part-time workers, or temporary workers, older workers, or others who've done everything right and still can't find a good job that will allow them to support their family. And I was mentioning a little bit about CEO pay. That compensation has grown much faster. And it's interesting, it continues to be high, and the typical worker pay has pretty much stayed the same. I just learned, because I do the corporate responsibility work, and I was trying to understand some things about the pharmaceutical industry. And the person explaining it said to me, well, because you're talking about high drug prices. And in order for the CEO pay to increase, they have to increase the prices of the drugs because they're not going to increase the volume that much. They're not able to increase the volume they sell. So you have to increase the prices so that you can increase the CEO pay. So I was trying to get that straight in my head. It has grown significantly since 1978. And I'm going to take the time to do just this little exercise to give you a sense of the difference of CEO pay over the decades, because I think it's just helpful to understand it. And CEOs are good guys too, and good women. But when I vote proxies for us, nobody needs a $26 million compensation package. They don't even need $10 million in my view, but anyway. Okay, I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. No. 2, 4, 6, 8. I can't count. It's part of finance first. Okay, do I have 7 people that could just, you have to hold a card and walk. That's all you have to do. And I'll have you line up over here. And if you don't want to walk, I'll let you merely be the average worker. Okay? Just, you take these and give them, oh, excuse me, hand them out to folks. Now, would you come over here, and you're just going to have to, we're going to have to do this as best we can around pillars and stages. I want you to line up here and face the TV screen. Okay, we've got 2, 4. Okay, we're getting some more here. No, you don't have to be in chronological order. No. Okay. And when you walk, we'll just have to walk in the space that's here. You can't walk straight, but that's okay. Okay. What this does, it helps us to visualize the change in CEO pay since about, 1960? Okay. So Sister Marceline Jean is the average worker. So she's going to stay there. So what we're going to look at is the CEO pay as a ratio times the average worker pay. Okay? And so we'll go back to 1960. So you hold up. In 1960, his pay was 20 times the average worker. 20. So I want you to take steps, but I'm going to have you divide it by 10, so you only get to take 2 steps. Okay? He takes 2. Okay, the next one is, looks like it's 1989, right? Oh, okay, 1989. Okay, by 1989, the CEO was making 50 times as much. You made 50 times as much as Sister Marilyn. So you take 5 steps. Okay, 95. In 1995, you made 112 times as much as Sister Marilyn Jean. So you'll take 11 steps. Let's see, who's next? 2000, okay. I lose my place here sometimes. And then we come to 2000. These were booming years. Oh, Joan, you're lucky. She made 344 times as much as Sister Marilyn Jean. So you take 34 steps. Yeah, just keep walking. Okay. We'll let her keep going. Okay, 2009. You remember what happened in 2008? Yes, okay. So 2009, Sister Georgiana, you only make 188 times. So that's almost 19 steps for you. Okay. So it dropped down quite a bit. And while she's going, we'll look at 2012. So we're rebounding a little bit. And you made 273 times as much. So you take 27 steps. He's going to have to take smaller steps to make it, yeah. And then we get to 2018. Forbes says it's about 278 times as much, so it's going up a little bit. So you take about 28 steps. So just go a little past Dave over here. Okay, but you get a visual of what's happened over the years and what has changed. And there's a lot of reasons for it, which I won't go into, and you can study those yourselves or we can talk about them, but it still is something that concerns us, and it concerns other people as well. Okay, thank you very much, and if Dave, you collect them for me. Okay, and we'll move on to solidarity and peace, and that would be Betsy.
We might look at that scenario and say, well, even though it's down from 350,000 to 210,000, That's okay because we can make it on 210,000, but that's not the way the billionaire thinks.
I've concluded, I always keep thinking, how much, what more can you do after the 10 million? What else how much is enough? How much is enough? Thank you. Okay, Betsy?
We are one human family, whatever our national, racial, ethnic, economic, and ideological differences. We are our brothers and sisters' keepers, wherever they may be. Loving our neighbor has global dimensions in a shrinking world. In particular, the richer nations have responsibilities towards the poorer nations, and people with wealth and resources are linked in the divine economy with those who lack them. At the core of the virtue of solidarity is the pursuit of justice and peace. We are called to be peacemakers. Our love for all our sisters and brothers demands that we promote peace in a world surrounded by violence and conflict.
Thank you. Solidarity is a word I've been using recently. I did a presentation on a webinar and came to a quote that talked about incarnation is God's solidarity with us. God sending Jesus, that's God's solidarity with us. And we are to prolong the incarnation with each other by our solidarity with each other. I just think that is just such a wonderful thought. And Pope Francis, he always has an interesting way of talking about things. He says the word solidarity is a little worn and at times poorly understood, but it refers to something more than a few sporadic acts of generosity. Here's what he says. It presumes the creation of a new mindset which thinks in terms of community and the priority of the life of all over the appropriation of goods by a few. That was his commenting about solidarity. So I'm just going to go through some things related to solidarity and peace. There's so many more, and I may have to cut these short because I always run out of time. So what does solidarity mean for us when we look at persons who are trafficked? When someone is trafficked, it means they're transported into a situation of exploitation. It can be forced labor, it could be forced marriage, it could be prostitution, and there is some trafficking also for organ removal. Now, there's a much greater awareness of this in our time, which is very good. And I always, if there's anything that I think we owe other people, it is to be aware of their plight. We may not always be able to do it, but to be aware. I remember in 2014 when the sisters were displaced in Iraq, and what they said was, it is so good to know that we are not forgotten. And so our awareness helps people to not be forgotten. Pope Francis has designated February 8th, the Feast of St. Josephine Bakhita, as a day of prayer and awareness about trafficking. Josephine was kidnapped as a child in Sudan, and then eventually she was sold to different people and mistreated, and was eventually ended up in Italy. At some point, she was freed, and she became a Canossian nun, a sister, religious sister. And so she dedicated her life to sharing her story of deliverance, but also reaching out to other people. And now we consider her the patron saint of victims of trafficking. You see that in the U.S. we have January, this current month is our Trafficking and Awareness Month, and then the 11th is the special day of focus in our country. It's estimated that between 20 million and 40 million are in this modern slavery today. It's very difficult to get good numbers because a lot of it isn't reported or it's not detected. And the thing about trafficking I learned long ago is that looking at trafficking, you have to do the whole analysis. You have to look at the economics, climate change, because in some countries, when they have to leave the rural area because they've had a drought for 6 years, they go to the cities, they have no way of supporting themselves. Here's an opportunity for our daughter to go get some education or to be employed, and she gets trafficked. All of those things are related. Just this piece, look at the money in trafficking. It's not as much as drugs, but it's a significant amount of money. And these figures are from the UN drug task force that tracks this kind of thing. We also tend to think that trafficking happens everywhere else but not the United States, and that's not true. We have our National Human Trafficking Hotline. These are the figures, the latest figures from 2017. Almost 11,000 cases were reported. I put the trafficking number up here. I put it in my phone contacts one time in case you ever see or suspect any trafficking situation. You have it with you that you can dial someone and tell them about it. So solidarity is really connected to our efforts for peace. And honestly, we tend to do things by violence. Look at assisted suicide, abortion. We avenge by doing more killing. Capital punishment, mass shootings, or just plain shootings. Bombing raids, war, drones that are used now. And sometimes it's not just physical actions that are so bad, but there are ways to demonize others and using hateful words and bullying. Often remember somebody commenting, it's even our language. When we wanted to focus on poverty, we called it a war on poverty. We focused on drugs, it was a war on drugs. We focus on terror, it's a war on terror. Even the language brings up a violent image. This quote by Martin Luther King Jr. about wars being poor chisels for carving out peaceful tomorrows it says it all, I think. But it also points out, how do we promote non-military and non-violent responses? I think it's a real challenge. It's a huge challenge. It was mentioned, I went to Iraq in 2015, so that was 6 months after the sisters were displaced. One night, Friday, well, it was the next morning I found out about it. They said that ISIS had tried to come into Erbil, which is the city we were in Kurdistan, which is northeastern Iraq. And but U.S. airstrikes kept them back. And I had to say, I was a little glad for U.S. airstrikes, considering where I was. But then, so there's not an easy answer to it. There's not an easy answer, but we still need to keep lifting it up. So I want to tell you about something that Pax Christi International, which is the International Peace Movement, and the Vatican have done. In April of 2016, they had a gathering, I think it was around 80 persons from around the world, and talked about this nonviolence and had people tell their stories. And out of that, they published this appeal to the Catholic Church to recommit to the centrality of gospel nonviolence, because that's what Jesus was about. And they've continued to meet and have discussion. They met again this April. They called it the Path of Nonviolence Toward a Culture of Peace. And I don't have anything published from them yet, but their hope is, they're sharing all of this with Pope Francis, that eventually he might do an encyclical on nonviolence. So, because our church has a history, this is what Jesus was about, and we're not using it as maybe we could use it to make a difference in our world. So here's some other pieces about what's happening. I mentioned earlier about military expenditures related to the UN budget. We know that war kills people. it maims people. They have PTSD and are struggling for the rest of their lives. It damages the environment. You have depleted uranium and farmers can't farm. But let's look at, this is just the money part of it. On the left side this was 2018. So you saw ours was nearly 650 billion. That's the US expenditures for military. In the middle is China, Saudi Arabia, India, France, Russia, UK, and Germany. The next 7 countries, we spend more than all of them together. And the last one is the rest of the world. That's how much we spend. Now, we want to be the best and the greatest and all of that. But how do we look at that in a way that promotes something besides excessive military spending? And this doesn't include the veterans. This doesn't include nuclear energy. This doesn't include interest on debt that we still owe from World War II. It doesn't include State Department defense funding. It doesn't include Homeland Security. It doesn't include any of those. So this is over and above that. You know, I every time, we send something like those military planes or drones, things that cost, $5 million, and you send it over and it crashes one time, you use it one time. It's just, is there a better way that we can do this? The other thing with military right now is that, well, first of all, I always like to remember Dwight Eisenhower when he left office, and he was a general, and he warned us. Now, this was back a number of years ago, so it wasn't like it is now. He warned us about the military-industrial complex, which means you have the armed forces, you have commerce, and you have politics very closely linked. And he said, beware of this. His speech on that is really quite good. And now we even have private contractors, which you've read about, doing some things that military used to do with less oversight. Like in Iraq, they talk about the contractors. Those contractors, many are former military, who when they leave the military and work for a contractor, they get paid a whole lot more. This gun picture is from outside the UN. It was donated by Switzerland. It's one of my favorite sculptures there. And this is talking about arms sales. As countries go, the largest arms sellers are the 5 members of the UN Security Council. Don't you think they'd know better? US, Russia, China, France, Germany, and Britain. They sell the most arms around the world. And if you're talking about companies, and this is just a new one for me, in the top 100 arms selling companies, the top 5 are US companies. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and General Dynamics. And they're all gearing up because in 2017, our administration announced that it was going to be giving out bids on a new arms modernization program. So we're going to be spending more money along those lines. And they're going to be looking at it. Next thing I want to look at in terms of solidarity and peace has to do with some things about incarceration in our country. I know it says to 2014, but it's pretty similar now. It might just be a little bit lower. We have approximately 2.2 million people in prisons and jails. If that incarcerated population were a city, it would be the 5th largest city in the United States. You have New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston, and then the incarcerated group. The crime rate has been decreasing, and even though it has, we still have the highest incarceration rate. That's a lot. Partly because we incarcerate folks for longer and for less serious things than other countries do. What I've been noticing too, and in fact I just noticed this a couple of years ago, I send out the death penalty list, and the 7 of the 10 states that have the highest incarceration rates are in the South. And also, when I look at the death penalty list, most of the executions, not all, but most of them are in former slave states. If you want to learn something about that, watch the documentary 13th. It's on the 13th Amendment. It's on Netflix. And it talks about what the 13th Amendment really did. It abolished slavery, except for incarceration. That's what it really says. So, and there's, besides just the people locked in prisons, you've got the parolees and the and being on probation, which takes in another, I don't know, let's see, I think it was like 3 or 4 million. So you've got that many people involved in the corrections system. Okay, I want to share this with you because CCA used to be the Corrections Corporation of America, and they've changed their name to be CoreCivic. This is a private contractor, and some of us went to the School of the Americas Vigil. This is from about 5 years ago, and part of that vigil was to go to Lumpkin, Georgia, a very rural area, 2.5 hours from Atlanta, and that's where they put a detention center for about 5,000 detainees. Our private prison corporations have, first of all, it's a fast-growing industry in our country, and they detain quite a few of our immigrants. When they sign a contract with a state, they have what's called a bed mandate. So if you don't have prisoners to fill their bed, you have to pay it. You just have to use tax money to pay for an empty bed because it's a bed mandate. And then when we go to they're taking in detainees, 60% of all immigrants that are detained are in private prisons. Now I want to tell you about our university, the University of Illinois here in Springfield. 2 law professors took some students in August to Dilley, Texas. You may have read about Dilley. It's a detention center. It's where asylum seekers were being detained. This is before we make them stay in Mexico, which is a whole other story. And these were mothers and children seeking asylum. So they went down. There was a legal project there to go in and talk to the families, find out their stories, and write it all down and so they could help them. And it was interesting to listen to them. And the rules at Dilley were very clear, and this is what I remembered. They were not allowed to comfort or hug any child, though many were sick and crying. They couldn't even touch them. If they did not follow the rules, not only they, the visitors, but all the lawyers there and the whole legal project would be evicted from Dilley. So if a mother was giving her story, they were allowed to shake her hand, but if she got up, these are hard stories that people are telling. Stories of fear and violence. And if she broke down and cries or walks out because she couldn't continue, they were not allowed to touch her to even give some comfort. So these are just hard things to hear about. But I was really pleased at our university for doing that kind of thing. And we've talked, talking about migrants. This is the whole question of refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. You see the number at the top. That just says anybody who's forcibly displaced. Like when we were in Iraq, the sisters weren't refugees. They were internally displaced persons. To be a refugee, you have to leave your country and go to another country. And then to really be a refugee, you have to register with the United Nations. So it says 41 million internally displaced, almost 26 million refugees, and about almost 4 million asylum seekers. And the hard thing is, most of these folks, if they're displaced outside their country, they're in another poor country because it's a neighboring country. And it's Syria and Yemen right now. The refugees from there are it's just horrendous. So, you ask yourself, what does solidarity mean when it comes to refugees and migrants? We in the U.S. are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We have space, and yet this fiscal year coming up, we started in October, we have lowered the number to 18,000 refugees that we'll take. 2 years ago, our number was 110,000. And another added piece right now is, if anybody wants to take refugee, it's like you have to opt in. Used to be somebody would say, no, I don't want him. Well, now you have to step forward and say, yes, we will take refugees if there are some. You have to allow for it to happen. And that's a new piece. If you want to know more about refugees or migrants and what's happening too, the U.S. Catholic bishops have a campaign called Justice for Immigrants. You can Google it online. They have very good information and good alerts and everything that goes with it. It's very, very helpful. Okay, let's move on to care for creation. Okay. And that is Stephanie. Okay.
We are all part of the community of creation and show our respect for the Creator by our care of creation. We are called to protect people and the planet, living our faith in relationship with all of God's creation. Catholic social thought has explicitly addressed environmental and ecological concerns in rather recent times, but the concern for respecting, sharing, and caring for creation has always been part of the tradition. Recent statements on the importance of environmentally and socially sustainable patterns of consumption and development have built solidly upon that part of the tradition. This environmental challenge has fundamental moral and ethical dimensions that cannot be ignored.
Thank you. One of my favorite pictures, isn't it? All the NASA pictures are wonderful that they send back to us. We use the term, we are stewards. We've long used that term. And I think sometimes that has not been good for us, because when we think of steward, we think that we are over something. So I always want to say that stewardship is a good word as long as it doesn't mean power over. If we're thinking of stewarding under the image of God, we are to be the image of God here. And so how would God steward this? We aren't the managers of creation. We're not here and creation's over here. We're a part of it, and that's really important for us. Pope Francis talks about another threat to peace, because he mentioned the dignity being denied. He says, it arises from greedy exploitation of environmental resources. And even if it is here, we must care for it and set it at the service of our brothers and sisters, including future generations. It reminds me of that quote. It's an ancient proverb. It says, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children, because whatever we take won't be there for them. So this issue has oodles of things, but I'm going to just focus on a couple. First of all, climate change, and you are hearing a lot about that. We have a choice. We can do something. And as far as scientists are concerned, human activity is causing the earth to get warmer. We have just use these glaciers. Glaciers are called the sentinels of climate change, and because they're very visible. It's kind of like the canary in the coal mine idea. As they melt, they add more water to the ocean, and that's causing sea levels to rise. I mentioned about New Jersey buying out property to hedge for that. I heard on NPR the other day a segment about I think it was in the Florida Keys, and they're considering raising up their roads to take care of the sea level rise. And then they found out it would cost them $60 million a mile, so they had to abandon that idea. So I'm not sure what they're going to do. And then I just think it's a wonderful thing about our Earth when we have all these complex relationships. And I mentioned before about bee colonies, all the things that they do, all the things that insects do, even if we don't like insects sometimes. They do wonderful things for us. We can't live without them. They can live without us, but we can't live without them. A couple of years ago, I was having this conversation. We were talking about the decrease in bugs, insects, because it's been documented that they're decreased. And this person said to me, okay, do you notice how many bugs are on your windshield? And I thought, oh, yeah, there aren't. If you drive in the summertime, remember 10 years ago or 15, your windshield would be covered when you got home on a summer night? It's not true anymore because there just aren't the insects out there. So when you clean your car, well, you're happy about that. But if you're looking at our future life, not so much. And this is the one that I would really want to highlight for you. Talking about water. You and I can survive for a month or more without eating food, but only a week or so without drinking water. It's so important for our bodies. Only 20% of the world population has access to running water. Children die every day from water-related illnesses. So here we have, this is always hard to visualize, but I want you to understand this. Of all the water on the earth, 97% of it is salt water, which we don't use. 3% is fresh water. Of that fresh water, only 0.5, a half a percent, is available fresh water to us. And all those glaciers going into the ocean, fresh water becoming salt water. So, to get a better sense of that, I always like it when people do these little connections here. If the world's water supply was 100 liters or 26 gallons, whichever you want to think of it as, then our usable supply of fresh water, that water down here that we could use, is a half a teaspoon. That's just to show the importance of how precious water is for us and our need to take care of it. So, what I always talk about, I know that sometimes you have to buy bottled water. I buy it sometimes when I travel. But buying bottled water promotes the privatization of water. Water should be a human right. It should not be privatized, so that if you're poor, you die because you don't get it. Selling water is a billion-dollar business. It's advertised sometimes as pure and sometimes it's just tap water. And it's important to know, big city tap water has to be tested 100 or more times a month. And bottled water plants only have to test once a week. So the testing is not the same unless it's changed in the last 6 months. And then you always know the story about Flint, Michigan. I heard some women activists there talking about this. Do you know, and I saw where Nestle's been giving them water for like a year or so. But do you also know that Nestle, for $200 a year, is able to take 130 million gallons of water from Michigan, from the wells of Michigan, and they have $7 billion in sales. So this whole thing of water is really significant. So we close here by, I want to say that thinking about our Catholic social teaching tradition is that we use two books to live by and to pray. We use our Bible, but we also use the book of life, what's happening in our world. We read the Bible, and because of that, we look at the world differently. You can't separate the two. For Dominicans, truth has not just been in Scripture and theology. It's in science, in sociology, anthropology, economics, all the others. Truth is always in all of that. So I've presented some things today. I've touched on some issues from the Book of Life. And I know that we all want to do something and to be the people that God called us to be in this world. So I invite you to be aware, to care, and then to do whatever you can do in your own situation where you are. As for us, we have some corporate stances, and these things I will send to you. I didn't make copies for you today. These are the things that we have focused on. We also focus on, like, immigration isn't up there, and yet we still focus on immigration. But when we do a corporate stance, what it does, it allows leadership to speak in our name about that issue. And then we also, we don't do just ourselves, but we work with other Dominicans in the U.S., and so the promoters we just finished this update to our call to justice, and I will make sure that you get that as well. But it's how we are working together with others across the United States and Canada to be a voice for the gospel call to justice. So, and I want to say, are folks already on the email, the candidates? Okay. So you've been getting emails from me on information and alerts. I know that you may not be interested in doing every one. You may not have time. All I ask is that you pay attention to it. Remember what I said about awareness, to be aware and to do whatever you can. Maybe it's to pray, maybe it is to call, maybe it's to respond in some way. And I wish blessings for you as you read the Bible along with the Book of Life. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Marceline. I'm sure there's no doubt in all of our minds why Sister is the leader and promoter of justice for our community. We're so grateful to you for your wealth of information, and that comes from a wealth of experience. And thank you for keeping us abreast of justice issues. If you are not receiving those emails, please be sure to see me and let me know. A couple of you have let me know that. Okay. Thanks also to those who brought our snacks today. Jim and Joe Powers tell me that they're not very happy that Rita and Jeff brought such good snacks, and Sister and Kara brought such good snacks today. They have to follow next time. So we're grateful for the snack bringers. Thanks also to our Springfield Cluster Associates, Carrie Becker and Erica Smith, who were with us helping us today. And our gratitude to Beth Murphy and Aaron, who is always with us each week. To Sister Martha Marie, who assists us with the setup and the help with the breaks. I hope you've had a chance to read the article that you received the last time from Joan Chittister. And just a reminder that if you haven't met with your sponsor about that article on Joan Chittister, we ask that you do that because she really speaks about that light that we are for each other and the light that we can bring to the world and spread it farther when we're doing it together, because we all have a different perspective on the truth. Our next meeting is going to be held on Sunday, the February 2nd, and this presentation is entitled Uncovering the Light of the Gospel. Because there will be 3 different presentations that day, we ask that you try to be here from 1 until 3:30. The presenters will be talking about our anti-racism efforts. Sister Kathleen Ann Tate, who's with us, and Robert Blackwell will present on that topic. Sister Rosemarie Riley will address the work of Jubilee Farm. And Sister Beth Murphy, Sister Claire Fickner, and Sister Lori Kirchman will talk about Cor Unum, our Dominican House of Hospitality. So that will be a full session for us. Please keep in your prayers Susan Mand, who's not with us today due to the surgery that she had, and also Mrs. Mary Helen Duffy, who is ill, and Kim Howard, who were not here today because of illness. Our prayers for Betsy, who is due any minute now, but is chosen to be with us today, and also for Kara and her bear that she brought today and her future little one. Please remember to leave your name tags before you go today, and may your month of January be blessed and filled with God's light. Thank you all for coming, and safe traveling home. God bless. Thank you for listening from afar.